studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Thursday, February 26, 2015. American University history professor and co-author of the Untold History of the United States, Peter Kuznick, joins us for a survey of current events in their historical context. And university students go on strike over college debt. We'll speak with one young man who's refusing to pay his loans in protest. Plus, so-called right-to-work legislation rears its head in Wisconsin again. We'll find out just how far such anti-labor laws have spread around the nation. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Chenjerai Kumanyika. He is an assistant professor of communication studies at Clemson University. Hi, Chenjerai.
Hey, how are you doing?
Doing well. Thanks so much for joining us. The U.S. and its allies have launched major bombing strikes in northeast Syria today, targeting the Islamic State group, which has reportedly kidnapped hundreds of Syrian Christians. Reports claim that ISIS has captured 10 Assyrian Christian villages inside Syria and has also killed, of course, in the past many non-Muslim groups, although it's not clear what their intention is for the latest mass kidnapping. Meanwhile, Kurdish Peshmerga fighters are continuing their battle against ISIS in a nearby area of Syria in an attempt to cut the group off from its Iraqi affiliate. And the Washington Post reported this morning that it has identified the masked ISIS member who has appeared in a number of beheading videos and known only as Jihadi John by his captives. Mohammed M. Wazi is a UK citizen who obtained a degree in computer engineering and comes from a well-off family in West London. He is thought to have traveled to Syria in 2012 when he joined ISIS. Well, Chenjerai, how effective do you think that the U.S. war has been? It's been fighting this war for more than 6 months now, but ISIS seems to simply be growing stronger.
Well, Sonali, the situation in Syria is certainly of concern. In Iraq, we've seen ISIS be beaten back to some extent, but in Syria, the problem is that no faction in Syria, Bashar al-Assad's regime or any of the major rebel groups, have concentrated their efforts on ISIS primarily. And so this is certainly worrisome, but there are some signs that elsewhere, ISIS is being beaten back. But I think that what we've just learned about this particular, terrorist is that it focuses our attention on the idea that, the victory over ISIS won't come really through military force primarily. It's going to come as we win over people who are skeptical of American power, in the Middle East and everywhere else.
And finally, an internal police investigation into the fatal shooting of a 35-year-old undocumented immigrant, Antonio Zambrano-Montes, in Pasco, Washington, has revealed that officers fired 17 bullets. Zambrano-Montes was killed on February 10th after police confronted him for throwing rocks at parked cars. A bystander's cell phone video of the shooting, which has been viewed over 1 million times, shows police chasing the unarmed man with his hands up in the air before he was shot. The fact that 17 bullets were discharged strengthens the case against police for overuse of force. The Mexican government, the ACLU, and others have lodged complaints over his death. Zambrano-Montes' mother traveled this week to Washington to view her son's body. The FBI is apparently monitoring the internal police investigation, and the news comes just 2 days after the Department of Justice and the FBI formally closed their investigation into the 2012 fatal shooting of Trayvon Martin in Florida and decided not to file any civil rights charges against the shooter, George Zimmerman. Well, speaking to the case of Antonio Zambrano-Montes in particular, Chenjerai, the New York Times and others called his death a Ferguson moment for the Latino community. Do you agree?
Well, I think there's certainly some elements there that could make this like Ferguson. One is that you have a police investigating unit who's already raised a lot of skepticism in that community with the lack of transparency in the investigation and the refusal to really engage in a way that brings people confidence that there's going to be a fair investigation. However, there's also the fact that Benjamin Crump has chosen to act, and Benjamin Crump represents Trayvon Martin's family, the family of Tamir Rice, and the family of Michael Brown. So it may be useful for those families and those constituencies to kind of come together to put pressure on the government to make sure that we have a fair trial.
And the Federal Communications Commission is expected to cast a historic vote today to classify the internet as a public utility in what will be a huge victory for net neutrality advocates. The vote, which appears to be happening in the morning hours as this program is being recorded, represents the culmination of years of work by grassroots organizations. The 3 Democrats on the 5-member FCC are expected to vote to preserve the internet as a free and open arena. Malkia Cyril of the Center for Media Justice said in an interview on Truth Out, quote, "Our digital rights are as important as our rights around incarceration and our rights around policing, our rights around food and housing. Our right to communicate is on par with these other rights." Chenjerai, do you agree with Malkia's sentiments?
Yes, I think that these digital rights are crucial for our information, and we appear to be on the verge of an important victory. We're going to have to continue to fight. Those who feel net neutrality is important are going to have to continue to fight because major media corporations will try to fight these regulations. But the other thing is that if you look at the involvement of the net neutrality movement with the Black Lives Matter movement, she talked about that, and that's very important because when we see with movements like the Black Lives Matter movement, they rely so much on social media and alternative media, and so it's been good to see those kind of coalitions happen.
Well, Chenjerai, I want to thank you so much, as always, for joining us, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you very much.
Chenjerai Kumanyika is our daily Newsflash guest expert. He's an associate professor of communication studies at Clemson University. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. In a little-noticed piece of news, Ukraine's Deputy Foreign Minister Vadim Pristaiko said on an interview this week that his country is willing to risk nuclear war with Russia over the ongoing conflict in the region. Specifically, Pristaiko said, "Everybody is afraid of fighting with a nuclear state. We are not anymore in Ukraine. However dangerous it sounds, we have to stop Russian President Vladimir Putin somehow." The conflict in the Ukraine has reared prospects of a second Cold War with Russia backing separatist rebels inside Ukraine, while the U.S. and Europe support a nascent government in Kiev. It was not long ago that the specter of mutual nuclear annihilation overwhelmed global discourse, and brinksmanship was all that remained between survival and mass extinction. But in all of history, the U.S. has been the only nation to actually deploy nuclear weapons. In fact, this year marks the 70th anniversary of the U.S. bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Joining me now to put current events into historical context is Peter Kuznick. He is a professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. He's the author of Beyond the Laboratory, Scientists as Political Activists in 1930s America, co-author with Akira Kimura of Rethinking the Atomic Bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japanese and American Perspectives, and he's collaborated with filmmaker Oliver Stone to co-author the 12-part Showtime documentary film series and book, both titled The Untold History of the United States. Welcome to Uprising, Peter.
Morning, glad to be here.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, how serious is the situation in the Ukraine currently? And most of the commentators we've spoken with say that Cold War fears are vastly overstated. And then, of course, the Ukrainian official says he's willing to risk nuclear war with Russia this week. Does that change things?
No, I don't think it really does change things. Vladimir Putin would not be reckless enough to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, nor would he have any need to do so. If Russia wanted to go to war against Ukraine, their conventional forces are certainly more than adequate to defeat the Ukrainian army. We saw what the Ukrainians were able to do against these disorganized rebels in southeastern Ukraine. So there's not really any threat to Russia in a military sense posed by Ukraine. But this kind of bluster is dangerous, and the situation in Ukraine is dangerous. You have to remember that the United States and Russia still have hundreds of nuclear missiles pointed at each other with thousands of nuclear weapons on hair trigger alert. So this is a certain kind of insanity that still has infected the world, that began with the nuclear bombings in 1945, that has never abated since then. So we still now have 16,300 nuclear weapons around the world, and it's a very, very dangerous situation.
How much more dangerous is the situation today than, say, during the height of the Cold War? I mean, during that time, it felt like, or it seemed like, at least from historical documents, I wasn't there at the time, but it seemed as though the risk of nuclear annihilation was something that people lived with and felt palpably and feared. But we don't even really talk about it very much anymore. Are we more safe now than we were back then?
Yes and no. The threat of a full-scale nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union, with tens of thousands of nuclear weapons pointed at each other, that threat has somewhat abated. Mm-hmm. Quantitative sense, it's definitely abated. And in an actual menacing sense of an imminent threat of that kind of nuclear war, certainly the possibility has been reduced. You have to remember that at the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviets had 70,000 nuclear weapons, and it was estimated that they had a destructive capability of 1.5 million Hiroshima bombs. So as our species really was insane, with 1.5 million Hiroshima bombs, what do we need that for? How many times do we have to be able to kill everybody on the planet over and over again before we're satisfied? That number has been reduced to 16,300. So in a quantitative sense, the numbers have diminished. But in terms of real threats, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist has its doomsday clock, which it corrects every few years depending on the threat of nuclear war. And it recently moved the doomsday clock 2 minutes ahead to say that we're 3 minutes from midnight, which means that the Nobel laureates, who are members of the board who determine the hands on the nuclear clock, think that the threat of nuclear war is actually increasing and increasing dramatically. The worst they ever had it was 2 minutes to midnight. Now it's 3 minutes to midnight. So it might not be the full-scale nuclear war we had nightmares about at the height of the Cold War, but still the possibility of nuclear war exists. And what we understand more and more is the dangers of nuclear winter. The estimate is that even a very limited regional nuclear war in which 100 nuclear weapons were used would threaten the lives of 2 billion people, the effects of which would be felt for at least 10 years. A larger nuclear war still could threaten to wipe out all life on the planet. Not that the bombs have to kill everybody, but the environmental effects of the nuclear bombings would have that devastating effect, create nuclear winter, cut off the sun, destroy the crops. People would starve to death, a miserable, miserable death for most people on the planet.
Now, of course, this year, as I said, is the 70th anniversary of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, and the U.S. has been the only country to drop, and in that case, 2 bombs, over 100,000 people killed, and the fallout, continues. How did that horror change the course of history, and how do you respond to those who still defend it, saying that had we not killed that many people at the time, we would have risked killing far more, and it was that which ended the war, etc.?
This is one of the things that we go into great detail on in our Untold History of the United States. It's a very important issue that I've been writing about for 2 decades now. The reality was that the atomic bombs, the excuse that was used by American officials, Stimson and others who wrote about this, and Truman's statements, was that we dropped the atomic bombs in order to avoid an invasion. That the United States was going to have to invade Japan. The invasion, Truman writes in his memoirs that Marshall told him it would cost 500,000 American lives. Stimson talks about 1 million American casualties. That's the myth. The reality was that the United States knew that Japanese were already defeated, that the Japanese were trying to get better surrender terms, including keeping the emperor, that the thing that the Japanese feared the most was the Soviet invasion, that they wrote about this repeatedly, that the Soviets were due to invade in early August. And so, and what finally ends the war is not the atomic bombing, it's the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. As the Japanese prime minister says, tomorrow they'll be in Hokkaido. Japan, the essence of Japan will be destroyed. We have to surrender now before we have to the Americans before we surrender to the Soviets, and the Soviets take over Japan. So that was the thinking of the Japanese at the time. The Americans knew that. Truman knew that. It's explicit in our policy statements that the thing that the Japanese fear the most is the Soviet invasion. The Soviet invasion will convince Japan that further resistance is unnecessary, that defeat is inevitable. And the Japanese knew that. So the other thing about the atomic bombing, the United States had already proven that it could wipe out Japanese cities. We firebombed over 100 Japanese cities. Destruction reached 99.5% in the city of Toyama. The Japanese leaders had accepted that the United States could wipe out cities. The big issue to them was not whether it was 1 plane and 1 bomb or 200 planes and thousands of bombs. It was the fact that they accepted we could wipe out cities. So the atomic bombings, in that sense, didn't change the equation. What did change the equation was the Soviet invasion. Now that undermined Japan's military strategy, its Ketsuga military strategy. It undermined its diplomatic strategy because they've been trying to get the Soviets to intervene to get them better surrender terms, to get them to keep the emperor, essentially. Most Americans don't realize that 6 of America's 7 5-star admirals and generals who got their 5th star during the war are on record as saying the atomic bombs were either militarily unnecessary, morally reprehensible, or in many cases, both. So we're talking about MacArthur, we're talking about Eisenhower, we're talking about Leahy, we're talking about the top Japanese leaders.
Now, Peter, how did the legacy of those bombings change Japan's own approach to war? I mean, you would think that it would have changed the U.S.'s approach to one of never again, since our government was the one that actually perpetrated these. But, of course, we have kept our imperialism strong, and it was really Japan who changed the way it approached the whole world in terms of foreign policy.
Interestingly enough, it was during the U.S. occupation, and it was MacArthur and his staff who helped draft Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which makes Japan having a peace constitution. Article 9 says the Japanese nation renounces the use of war as a tool of foreign policy or even the threat of war. So Japan becomes the most peaceful nation in the world. It says we can't maintain offensive nuclear forces, and Japan holds on to that view. In fact, the Japanese people embraced it. During the Korean War, the United States had second thoughts and wanted to change the Japanese constitution so that Japan could help with the United States in Korea. However, the Japanese people and their leaders resisted American pressure to change the peace constitution. Unfortunately, now the Abe administration an extreme right-wing nationalist administration that runs Japan is trying to change Article 9. They've already supported collective self-defense. They're now trying to officially undo Article 9 so that Japan can maintain offensive military forces and work with the United States in many parts of the world. Sadly, it was Obama who helped put Abe into power. The Japanese Democratic Party was elected, and Hatoyama was elected on basically a peace platform to a large extent, but one of the fundamental issues was that he was opposed to the relocation of the U.S. Marine base from Futenma to Hinoko on Okinawa, and Obama insisted that they relocate the Marine base to Hinoko, as the previous government had agreed to. And Obama came in there and smashed Hatoyama, effectively undermined his credibility, forced him to capitulate to the United States, and then that leads to the weakness of the Japan Democratic Party and return to power of the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, the conservative forces, who Obama was sadly much more comfortable in dealing with. And that's what got us this right-wing Abe administration in Japan.
Right, which is now turning back some of the aspects of the peace constitution. But I'm glad you brought up Obama, because when President Obama became president initially, he started his early years as wanting to draw down nuclear weapons around the world and the stockpiles. He made a major speech, and it really heartened a lot of anti-nuclear activists. What happened to that? We hardly ever hear about it anymore.
Obama's Prague speech was actually a very, very positive statement, and he called for eliminating nuclear weapons, abolishing nuclear weapons. But even in that speech, you hear him hedging. He says it may not happen in my lifetime, certainly not in his administration. And he also effectively says that the United States is not going to be the first country to do away with its nuclear arsenal. The United States is going to be the last country to do away with its nuclear arsenal. So we had some hints there that Obama was stating a certain principle, but we were optimistic partly because Obama seemed to really believe this. Most people don't remember that Obama marched in Central Park in 1982 in that huge anti-nuclear march. 1 million people demonstrated in New York in 1982 for a nuclear freeze and eventually abolition of nuclear weapons. Obama was one of them. So there was reason to assume that in this, Obama was sincere. But like in everything, or most everything else, Obama was a disappointment. And he capitulated to the more conservative voices around him, the hawkish voices, the Hillary Clintons, the other supporters, the Jones and other supporters he had, because he surrounded himself with these militarists as his advisors. And if you look now, Obama is supporting the modernization of America's nuclear forces, a policy that is going to cost $1 trillion over the next 30 years, the next 3 decades. And this is Obama's policy. So instead of doing away with nuclear weapons, as was required by the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the 1968 treaty, it said that the 5 nuclear powers, the acknowledged nuclear powers then, had to move toward getting rid of their nuclear stockpiles. The United States and the others have maintained their nuclear stockpiles. And the Marshall Islands, of all countries, is suing now an international court in order to try to get the nuclear powers to agree to follow through on their commitments back in 1968.
Now, Peter, there have not been that many figures historically in U.S. politics who had the courage to openly denounce the pursuit of nuclear weapons and, at least during the Cold War, want to, openly end it. And one of the people who did fulfill that description that you and Oliver Stone write about in your book and feature in your film was Henry Wallace, Vice President of the U.S. along FDR for his first term, went on to be replaced by Truman only months before FDR died. And you've written much about this chapter in U.S. history in terms of what might have been had Wallace remained FDR's running mate. How progressive was Wallace, both in the issue of war but also social issues?
Wallace, sadly, is forgotten by most Americans today. Wallace was a visionary figure. He was Roosevelt's Secretary of Agriculture during the New Deal. In 1940, when Roosevelt was running for a 3rd term, he wanted a real progressive on the ticket because he knew we were heading toward a war against fascism and militarism, and he chose Henry Wallace over the objections of the party bosses, who who are going to get their revenge back in 1944, 4 years later. And Wallace, as vice president, was a great visionary. When Henry Luce makes his speech saying the 20th century should be the American century, the United States should dominate the world, Wallace followed that up and challenged Luce, and he says it shouldn't be the American century, but it's the century of the common man in the tradition of the American, the French, the Latin Americans, and the Russian revolutions. He calls for a worldwide people's revolution. And he says that we have to end monopolies, end cartels, end colonialism, end exploitation, spread the fruits of science and technology around the world. And so in 44, when he was running again, he had a lot of enemies. The British and the French put pressure on Roosevelt to get him off the ticket because he's a leading spokesman against colonialism. The Southern conservatives and segregationists hated him because he's a leading spokesperson for black civil rights. The business community hated him because he was a leading spokesperson for labor. He had denounced America's fascists. He said, well, those people who think Wall Street comes first and the American people second. The conservatives hated him, and they waged his campaign within the Democratic Party through the party bosses to get rid of Wallace on the 1944 ticket. Despite that, Wallace almost prevailed anyway because he was the second most popular man in the United States behind Roosevelt. The day that the Democratic Convention began in Chicago, July 20th, 1944, Gallup released a poll showing that 65% of American voters said they wanted Wallace back on the ticket as vice president. 2% said they wanted Harry Truman. So the party bosses had to control the convention, engineer this coup, basically, to get Wallace off the ticket and Truman on. Truman was a basic non-entity. He had been ridiculed as a senator from Pendergast, this corrupt political machine. He was not a major player. He was not in any way knowledgeable about these issues, but the bosses thought he was pliable and he would do their bidding. So they tried to get him on the ticket. In the midst of a spontaneous demonstration for Wallace, Senator Claude Pepper fights his way through the crowd. He knew that if he could get Wallace's name and nomination that first night, Wallace would sweep the convention, be back on the ticket as vice president, and then he would have been the one to become president on April 12, 1945, when Roosevelt died, instead of Truman.
And then who knows what kind of a country we might have been living in at that time and maybe even through today.
Yeah, it could have been fundamentally, dramatically different. It would have been a battle on Wallace's part, but he was a fighter, a man of great vision and great principle. He stays on in the cabinet under Truman as secretary, first under Roosevelt, and then stays on for a year under Truman as Secretary of Commerce. And from that position, he wages a battle against the Cold War, and he's the leading spokesperson for the abolition of nuclear weapons. So he maintained those principles, and he would argue with Truman and convince Truman. The problem with Truman was he wasn't a committed war hawk in the sense he was not a genocidal maniac in some crazy sense. Truman was a decent guy with very little knowledge, very little backbone, who would replace reason with bluster because he realized how little he himself understood. And he surrounded himself with these hacks, the people who Roosevelt would never have turned to for advice on foreign policy. And these people were hardline anti-communists, very conservative, much more militaristic, and they pushed Truman in a direction that he was willing to go. And finally, in September of 46, he fires Wallace from the cabinet. And then the last voice against the Cold War, the last voice for nuclear disarmament is out of the cabinet. By that point, Wallace was the last of the old New Dealers who was still in an influential position. Truman had replaced them all.
Well, Peter Kuznick, I want to thank you so much for helping us shine a light on these historical events and their relevance to what's happening today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
My guest, Peter Kuznick, is a professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. He's the author of Beyond the Laboratory, Scientists as Political Activists in 1930s America, co-author with Akira Kimura of Rethinking the Atomic Bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japanese and American Perspectives. And of course, he's collaborated with filmmaker Oliver Stone to co-author a 12-part Showtime documentary film series and book that are both titled The Untold History of the United States. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Gohatkar. You can now subscribe for direct access to all our shows online at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Your subscription sustains the TV production of Uprising. A few years after the Occupy Wall Street movement, a group of intrepid former students have decided to go public about the overwhelming debt they owe for their college education. A campaign called Debt Collective has announced a debt strike by a group of 15 students who are publicly refusing to pay back their federal and private college loans as an act of protest. The students all attended institutions operated by Corinthian Colleges, Inc., a nearly defunct private for-profit higher education provider. Dozens of Corinthian colleges have closed down, and the Federal Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and others have even sued the company. Some students involved in the debt strike were in the middle of obtaining their degrees when their institutions shut down, leaving them with no degree and lots of debt. The Department of Education apparently has the power to forgive Corinthian student debt, but is unwilling to wait any longer. The Corinthian 15, as they're called, are taking a public stand right now. Student debt as a whole has reached epic proportions nationally, with more than $1 trillion owed by former students as of now. The burden of debt has significantly impacted the ability of young people to move out of their parents' homes, start their own families, and achieve financial independence. Joining me in studio today is Nathan Horns. He's an organizer with Debt Collective and one of the Corinthian 15. Also with us on video is Hannah Appel, also an organizer with Debt Collective and an assistant professor of anthropology at UCLA. Welcome to Uprising, Nathan and Hannah.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, Nathan, let me start with you. Can you tell me what your experience with Corinthian was, and, what sort of degree were you pursuing? What sort of debt have you incurred, and did they shut down before you got your degree, as was the case with some others?
Okay, so my experience with Everest was the same as...
And Everest College is owned by a Corinthian.
Corinthian, yes. So Corinthian and Everest is the the campus that I went to. And basically what my experience is the same as any other student. I went to school, I did the homework.
What was your degree in?
Business. Mm-hmm. I got a bachelor's in business administration, and
so you managed to complete your degree?
I completed my degree. The school, literally, I was the class that was right before the shutdown. So now all these things are happening, and the school's under fire. They're being investigated, and I graduated just recently, right before that happened.
And can you say how much you owe?
$68,000.
$68,000.
Yes, ma'am.
And how does that impact your ability to just live?
I can't. I live in a studio apartment with my aunt because I cannot afford to pay rent. I pretty much lost everything after going to that college.
And of course, these days, getting a degree is no guarantee of jobs
Absolutely
or any
not.
financial security.
Absolutely not, and that's the reason why I went to Everest. They said that they would help me find a job. They would help me. They had a network of employers waiting for me as soon as I graduated, and it did not happen. They did not do what they said they were going to do.
I want to turn to Hannah Appel. Hannah, I understand this campaign came about because some of the folks involved in Strike Debt, which was this sort of campaign arose, originally from Occupy Wall Street. We'd covered it on our program, and Strike Debt had been collecting donations to buy up other types of debt, but also college debt from banks in order to forgive people's debts. They wiped out millions of dollars of debt, and by many accounts, that's pretty successful. So is this the sort of next step, Debt Collective, where people are actually literally saying, we're not going to pay as a way to up the ante?
Absolutely. So the program you referred to was called the Rolling Jubilee, and we have actually abolished $30 million of both medical debt and student debt simply because what's called distressed debt is available actually for pennies on the dollar on secondary markets. But that was always, the Rolling Jubilee was always kind of a spectacular tactic. We wanted to draw people's attention to the fact that their debts were not worth what they thought they were worth. So now what we want to do, the fact is we could never buy all of the illegitimate debt sloshing around on the market. For example, federal debt to these horrible predatory for-profit colleges is not available on these secondary markets. So having done that, having drawn the attention to debt as a systemic issue and student debt as a part of that, now we want to say, look, debtors acting collectively actually have a tremendous amount of potential power. Right now, we all deal with our debts with shame, with isolation, with all of this sort of moral baggage. And the debt collective, Strike Debt, before it has always aimed to shift that shame and isolation to the possibility of collective action. So debt collectives, debtors unions are absolutely the next step. We're so excited about the Corinthian 15. They're just an incredibly brave, strong, intelligent group of people, and we think we're going to win, and that's going to set a real precedent for the collective action of debtors going forward.
So, Nathan, what does it mean for you to take the stand? Because, I mean, there is, as Hannah was saying, the sort of moral baggage associated with debt, and people in this country really feel very strongly, personally, about having to pay off one's debt is extremely important. Other people in other countries have a different cultural approach, I think, to going into debt. But then there's also the practical price you pay for getting your, having your credit scores be impacted, which then affects your ability to take out further loans. You must be paying a bit of a price for this.
There's a very big price to pay. And we've spoken with attorneys. We know exactly what we're doing. We know what we're getting into. And we're prepared for those consequences because we know we're doing the right thing. And for me, it's just, I refuse to pay a debt to somebody when you've done something that is not only immoral, but it should be illegal. You used us, you abused us, you lied to us.
And what way did Corinthian abuse you? I mean, you did get your degree, right?
Okay, so yes, I went to the school and I got a degree, but there were times where we're playing Monopoly as a final.
Huh?
Yes.
So you're saying the quality of your education
was very poor. There were students that would come to school for the 2 hours that they were asked to come to school out of a 4-hour class and leave, but they still got the same grade as me. Or there were
And then
teachers,
once you were done, how was your degree viewed by potential employers?
I went to Wells Fargo to tried to apply for a job, and they laughed at me in my face.
Because of your degree?
Because of my degree. And then come to find out Wells Fargo is a very big contributor to Corinthian College.
But they don't even take their degree seriously.
But they don't even take the degree seriously.
Huh. So Hannah, you mentioned that you're confident that you can win, but what exactly are students and activists like yourself trying to win here? Is this action to refuse to pay debt meant to pressure the Department of Education to forgive all federal debts?
I mean, I think we want to think strategically and tactically, right? So with the Corinthian 15, they were effectively led into a predatory lending trap. It was a debt trap. And it is well within the Department of Education's existing mandate. In other words, no laws would have to change for the Department of Education to discharge the debt of every single current and former Corinthian student. That is already within their mandate. When debt is incurred under fraudulent circumstances, and as you mentioned in the beginning, the Corinthian Colleges is being sued by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. It's under investigation by something like 21 attorneys general. I mean, it's in serious trouble. The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, has looked into it. By all accounts, this school was fraudulent. It was hardly a school. It was a for-profit corporation masquerading as a school. And it is very obvious to all of us, and not only those of us who are activists on this issue, that these students' debt should be discharged. And that, I think, would then help us set a precedent to think about how debtors can act collectively, both to refuse illegitimate debts and to begin to renegotiate and reimagine kinds of debts that may be legitimate, but in which we might want to renegotiate interest rates, et cetera.
So actually, let's talk about that, because what is legitimate versus illegitimate debt, Hannah? Because even though someone might get their degree from a reputable institution, but find themselves, you know, tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, not be able to find a job, even if the institution may not be at fault, as Corinthian seems to clearly be, we have a societal problem here that really should be looking at the student debt as something that's dragging not just students, but society down.
That's absolutely right. So there's a real danger in this particular campaign, the Corinthian 15 campaign, that could look like Corinthian is a bad apple, right? Or could look like even for-profit schools are a bad apple, and as long as we get rid of for-profit schools, everything will be okay. And that is fundamentally not the case. The system in which I am a professor, the venerable University of California system, used to be public. Meaning you used to be able to go here as a citizen of California for an affordable price. And at this point, most of my students are graduating with $25,000, $30,000, $35,000 in debt. Most of them as the first people in their college to have gone, in their family to have gone to college. And even institutions that were never public, New York University, for example, the way that higher education across the board has gotten involved in the financial sector, and the way that tuition consequently has skyrocketed as universities like the UC system get involved in interest rate swaps and get on the wrong side of these things. In other words, the skyrocketing price of tuition at all schools across the country has become a systemic problem for individuals, right? For the individual debt burdens of Nathan, of me. I have a tremendous amount of student debt, more than Nathan, actually. And so what we need to do, right, we have suddenly become a class. We have suddenly become a class of people who can get together. We have a tremendous amount of leverage to say, hey, wait a minute, this is a systemic problem, and we now need a collective seat at the table in order to renegotiate it. And as you said, I think the interest can be shared insofar as we will be, for people who like to think in these terms, a tremendous drag on the economy going forward.
Right. And a related story, but outside of the scope of our discussion today, is how adjunct professors are being treated as a source of extremely poorly paid labor as well. There was a walkout this week. Nathan, do you hope to expand the Corinthian 15 beyond the 15 of you? You're one of the 15, and are you hoping that this action that you're taking will inspire not just other former and current Corinthian students, but even other students saddled with college debt to join you and say, I'm not going to pay this anymore. This is ridiculous.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want everybody to know that this is not just the Corinthian 15. This is anybody who feels like you went to college and you didn't get what you deserved. This is anybody who wants to stand up for their rights. And that's what I feel like the Corinthian 15 is about. And we have been growing and we have been expanding. And that's the best part about it, is it's not just the Corinthian 15. We have over 1,000 people that have joined us. And that's amazing.
1,000 people who have said that they're not going to pay their debts?
That have said they're not going to pay. They have signed up to strike.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so among our audience, if there's people who are considering doing this right now,
join us.
I mean, what do they risk? Do they risk debt collectors coming and knocking on their door? Well, I don't know, knocking on their doors, but at least hounding them on the phone?
There are ways around that, though, and we can help you. Go to debtcollective.org, and we will contact you, and we will let you know the real, exactly what could happen, and how you can go about not paying these loans, because you shouldn't have to pay illegitimate loans.
Well, Nathan, best of luck to you. Finally, Hannah, debtcollective.org is the website that Nathan mentioned. Anything you'd like to add as well in terms of encouraging students? Are there professors who are supporting students? Because, you know, technically, the fees and tuition that students pay, part of it goes to paying professors.
That's right. That's absolutely right. This is my salary at stake, and yet many of us professors also have a tremendous amount of student debt, right? So we can't imagine that people stand on one or the other side of this issue. Yeah, I just have two quick things that I'd like to say in closing. I love Nathan's enthusiasm, and as he said, and as you said, Sonali, please come to debtcollective.org. Right now, we are intaking strikers for the Corinthian 15. We are very mindful of the very serious legal and financial and personal consequences that going public with a strike that attends to deciding to go public. And so we have a very careful intake process for students. So if you are a current and former Corinthian student, you can sign up for this particular strike on our website. For the rest of us who have federal loan debt from Sallie Mae or Navient, you'll also see a place to sign up. The final thing that I want to say is that the debt problem today is not only a student debt problem. And the Debt Collective aims to organize debtors, both student debtors, but far beyond that, right? People whose homes have been wrongfully foreclosed on and who are now renting the homes that they once aspired to own and still paying bank fees. None of those people have seen justice in a collective way, right? Our nation is radically skewed. The power structure in our nation is radically skewed toward creditors, people who are taking out payday loans and vicious cycles of check cashing. Our criminal justice system in Ferguson, Missouri, 40% of that budget comes from criminal justice fines. And if you don't pay those fines, if you are a criminal justice debtor, you go back to prison. So debt is a systemic issue and an incredible potential platform for organization. So we start with the Corinthian 15, we move to Sallie Mae, we move to foreclosures, we move to criminal justice debt. In other words, it's a very much a systemic, our vision is a systemic vision.
Well, I want to wish the two of you the best of luck, and thank you so much for joining us today. Hannah Appel joining us via Skype, an organizer with Debt Collective and an assistant professor of anthropology at UCLA. In studio with me, Nathan Horns, an organizer with Debt Collective, one of the Corinthian 15. This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll go to Wisconsin. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. 4 years ago, Wisconsinites revolted in response to a draconian measure gutting many hard-won labor rights. In an occupation of the Capitol that lasted weeks and drew as many as 100,000 protesters and international news coverage, ordinary people in the state of Wisconsin rose up against anti-worker sentiments pushed by Republican Governor Scott Walker. Since then, Walker has been able to stave off a recall effort and win re-election. Perhaps emboldened by that, he's pushing a controversial bill now curtailing the power of organized labor once more. Under the euphemistic title of the right to work, Walker and his fellow Republicans are fast-tracking a bill that would make it illegal for unions to collect mandatory dues from all members of a bargaining unit, even if those members benefited from the union's power. Such laws have passed in numerous states around the country, but in some states, such as a law in Indiana that Wisconsin's law is closely modeled on, they've been struck down in court. Well, just how close is Wisconsin to disempowering its unions? Joining me to answer that question is Jeffrey Sommers, Associate Professor of Political Economy and Public Policy in Global Studies and Africology at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Welcome to Uprising, Jeffrey.
Hi.
Now, what exactly does the bill in question stipulate, and could it really strip Wisconsin unions of real power?
Oh, of course, it absolutely will. Now, this has already been done with the public sector workers with 2011, which was the reason that we had these very, very big protests. It was regarding this Act 10 law, and that essentially stripped public sector workers of these rights. So now Walker is following up with private sector workers with this right to work legislation. Now, it should be said that the police and the firemen are actually exempted from this. So these are the two sectors that I guess will not have the right to work in the language of the Wisconsin Republican Party.
And so that's quite interesting. And of course, these are traditionally unions that the right has often called upon and allied with. How do they justify this difference between these two sort of groups of organized workers?
Well, they really don't. And of course, it really represents a massive contradiction between their rhetoric and the reality of what they're doing. So, of course, they want to have these two sectors, the police and the firemen, loyal to them. And of course, the governor seems to think that perhaps, I guess, the police are a kind of Praetorian guard, which need to be treated well. But of course, if one looked at it purely from the perspective of the discourse of the Republican Party in Wisconsin, we would say that they're being treated terribly, that they do not have the right.
Right, exactly.
So it's quite hypocritical and almost funny.
Right, because the Republicans are saying that this is something that they're doing to help workers. And let's just clarify for our listeners what we mean when what Republicans really mean when they say it's a right-to-work state is that when a union comes in or when there is a workplace that is unionized, the bargaining unit that's part of that workforce is supposed to pay union dues. You're not supposed to be able to check off necessarily whether you want to pay union dues or not. You're either part of the union if you want to be in that workplace, or you're not in the workplace altogether, because everyone benefits from the union's their bargaining power. And they collect dues, and those dues go into keeping that union powerful, also go into helping the union do their own political lobbying. And now they want to make it voluntary, those dues voluntary rather than mandatory. And it sounds like, of course, just a matter of individual choice. Is it?
Well, it would be like if you just didn't feel like paying your taxes.
Right.
So you just relied on your neighbors to do this. And of course, the more people that opt out from paying, the more that places the burden on those who actually are paying. So the goal here is to really destroy the unions, and of course they will do so. And the chief target is the Democratic Party. So in other words, labor unions are a significant funder of the Democratic Party, and so they don't want their opposition funded. So they're going this route. And one of the reasons that they will be increasingly successful is that as labor gets continually weaker, they can really confer fewer and fewer benefits on their workers. And so as wages just continue to go down, more and more people are just making the decision that they really can't afford to pay union dues when they're not getting the benefit of raises. So it really is eviscerating the power of labor unions.
And it feeds in on itself. Now, 4 years ago, the Democratic Party legislators took a strong stand. Many of them even fled the state so that they could say, hey, I'm not there for the vote, so you don't have quorum, you can't vote. I mean, this was a pretty serious protest. And of course, outside the voting halls were people camping out, thousands, tens of thousands, and in some cases, 100,000 people. What are the protests looking like this week, both from the Democratic Party and ordinary people?
Sure. Well, there's not going to be another fleeing, of course, because this just will not do from the perspective of the Republican Party. And so it's much smaller. I mean, we haven't even seen protests in the thousands. I mean, so we are not going to see a reprise of 2011 here. It's really a fait accompli. I mean, it's going to be done. The state Senate has passed it. The state legislature will pass it next, and the governor will sign it. It's a done deal, unfortunately.
Now, they fast-tracked this bill, I understand, and there was only one public hearing. The Senate Labor Committee was supposed to have a public hearing, and people were organizing around it, and all of a sudden the vote was done and it passed the committee. Can you tell us the sort of farce that's playing out in terms of the Democratic discourse that should be taking place on this?
Yeah, well, I think from their perspective, they see themselves as having been elected, and once elected, they can just do whatever they want. So the public are, kind of a nuisance, and from their perspective, are representing a minority interest in the state. So, they won these electoral majorities, ergo, they get to rule and do whatever they want. So they're really not paying much heed to procedural niceties. Now, all of that said, we have to remember that there were massive amounts of external money that were spent here. And the state legislative district lines were redrawn, and there was a very serious kind of gerrymandering of districts, which was done to make the Republican majorities even bigger than they were. That said, I don't want to give the impression that Scott Walker is not popular. He definitely is. He won a general election across the entire state. So gerrymandering has nothing to do with his victory, but it certainly does with the state legislators and the state Senate.
Now, what about addressing this law in court? I mentioned the Indiana law that this is modeled on was struck down in court. Can Wisconsin courts actually strike this down?
I don't think that's going to happen. The composition of the courts is such that it's just highly unlikely.
And so then how far have such laws spread around the country, and who can we point the finger at? Alec, the Koch brothers, both?
Oh, well, absolutely. And similar organizations. You have to remember that in Wisconsin, we have this kind of dualistic character. It's kind of like a Brazilian soap opera with this evil and good twins that are coexisting. So, we've had this very progressive tradition with figures like Robert La Follette and others. And then, we've had Joe McCarthy, and we've also had, the industrialists, which were the initial founders of right-wing think tanks in this country, such as the Heritage Foundation and the Bradley Foundation. I mean, this is where they were born. They were born among these industrialists here in Wisconsin. And so this is something that they've always wanted to do. I mean, it defunds the Democratic Party from their perspective, especially in local elections, helps to drive down wages, but that goal has already been accomplished, so that battle they've already won. So it really seems as though it's a means to perhaps reduce the amount of money that they have to spend on elections to defeat Democrats.
So what about the fact that Scott Walker has his sights set on the White House? Does he see the pushing of this right-to-work law as a campaign issue that he can ride on to Washington, D.C.?
Oh, absolutely. Of course, before you actually win the presidency, you have to win the primaries and the caucuses. So he has to win the votes of the extremists within his party. And he's doing that. I mean, if you've seen the latest polls, he's just pulled away by some 10 percentage points from the rest of the pack. He's done several things which, in my estimation, have not been in the interests of Wisconsinites. So, for instance, even though I'm not personally a particular fan of casinos, in the southeastern part of the state, there was a casino that was proposed by the Menominee tribe, very, very popular among the residents of southeastern Wisconsin. They really wanted it. Governor Walker hesitated to make a decision in the year before the decision needed to be rendered. Right after the election, he then said no, and this was only some 6 days after receiving a letter from 600 GOP social conservative activists in Iowa, which of course is the first caucus, stating that their opposition, and he just rejected it. Not only that, but they were going to bring forward some $220 million to help finance a new stadium for our professional basketball team, the Bucks. Now the taxpayers of Wisconsin will have to pick that up. Furthermore, with Medicaid, he's rejected those funds from the federal government. So that's going to cost our state some $241 million over the next 2 years. We're a small state, some 5.6 million people. So Wisconsinites are paying massively, and by that I mean the taxpayers. We are really, really, really paying for this governor's White House run. Now, whether or not he'll be like a Ronald Reagan figure with the kind of Teflon coating and these things just slide off him, hard to say.
Well, we shall see. I want to thank you so much for joining us today, Jeffrey Sommers, and shedding some light on this very troubling trend. And we'll certainly also see how it plays out around the country. Thank you so much.
Sure, you bet. Take care.
My guest, Jeffrey Sommers, is an associate professor of political economy and public policy and global studies in Africology at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. And we've been talking about the so-called right-to-work laws that are being pushed through in Wisconsin and around the country. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Darren White is our research intern. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Christian Beck is our production assistant. Federico Garcia, Kiana Turner, and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Your subscription sustains the TV production of the show. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. See you tomorrow.